Her son laughed when his fiancée's mother said, "She doesn't belong here." Veronica Hale, architect, matriarch, and owner of the house they stood in, didn't flinch. Evan chuckled, never noticing the champagne in his hand was poured from her cellar, under her roof. By month's end, he'd be evicted, the wedding plans erased, and his name scrubbed from every future she once imagined for him. She had built a legacy brick by brick. Now she was done sharing it with those who mistook her grace for permission. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. Veronica stood on the fringe of the garden, her fingers lightly brushing against the hydrangeas. The petals were soft and cool, a quiet contrast to the distant murmur of laughter and clinking glasses around her. The evening air carried the scent of fresh blooms and polished silver, but beneath it all, there was a weight, something subtle but heavy pressing on her chest. The champagne in her hand felt too light for the heaviness she couldn't shake. She didn't belong here, not really. The laughter around her sounded like it belonged to someone else, the guests dressed in shades of silk and satin, their smiles easy and effortless, as though the evening had been made for them. Veronica was a shadow among them, a spectator, her smile frozen in place as she tried to fit into a world that didn't quite fit her back. Her gaze drifted toward the group near the fountain, Evan and Valerie at the center, their heads together in some private conversation. The way they stood, close but never quite touching, as if there was a thin invisible line between them that no one could cross, made her stomach twist. Evan, her son, with his soft laughter and easy charm. Valerie, sharp and perfect, the kind of woman who floated through life with a grace that always seemed effortless. They look like they don't belong here. The words sliced through the hum of the crowd, spoken too loudly for comfort, yet too casually to be anything other than a quiet dismissal. Veronica froze. Valerie, always with her biting observations, always so quick to draw lines between who fit and who didn't. The laughter from Evan followed, a soft chuckle that was all too familiar in its hollow warmth. He didn't even bother to defend her, didn't soften the edges of Valerie's comment. Instead, he simply let it hang there, like a cloud drifting by that he'd never bothered to acknowledge. Veronica could feel the sting of the words, sharp and unsettling, but she didn't react. She didn't turn to face them or let their voices have any more weight than they deserved. She could feel her heart thumping too loudly in her chest, but she masked it, wrapping her emotions in a thick layer of indifference. And then, Isla. Isla passed by, walking swiftly in her pale dress, her heels clicking against the gravel, but she stopped, just for a second. Her face froze, a brief flicker of something crossing her features, discomfort, maybe surprise, maybe guilt. Veronica couldn't quite place it, but she saw it, that brief crack in Isla's composed exterior. The moment stretched on, Isla's back stiffening as she turned away, but it was too late. Veronica had caught it, the tension in her posture, the slight quiver of her lips as if she'd been caught in something she didn't want to acknowledge. For a second, Veronica wondered if Isla had heard Valerie's comment. The thought made her pulse quicken, but before she could follow it further, Isla resumed her walk, her movements calm, composed, as though nothing had happened. She didn't glance back at Veronica. She never did. It didn't matter. Neve's soft voice brought her back to the moment, a steady warmth beside her. Veronica didn't even have to look to know it was Neve. She felt her presence like a tether, grounding her in the chaos of the evening. "You okay?" Neve asked, her voice low, tentative. Veronica hesitated, the lie on the tip of her tongue, ready to slip out like it always did. She was fine. Of course she was fine. But the truth felt too jagged to put into words. Instead, she gave a small nod, the motion almost imperceptible. "I'm fine," Veronica said, her voice soft, though it was a lie. But sometimes the lie was easier. It was simpler. Neve didn't press, didn't need anything more. She simply stood by her, offering her silent support. It was enough. Veronica's gaze shifted back to the hydrangeas, her fingers still tracing the edges of the blooms. The night felt endless, the laughter around her only amplifying the isolation she felt. She wasn't part of this. She never would be. But there was something else stirring beneath the surface, a quiet fire that refused to die. Valerie's words, Evan's silence, weren't going to define her tonight. They wouldn't push her to the edges, no matter how much they tried. The game was only just beginning, and Veronica wasn't ready to fade into the background. Not yet. The house was still hers. Veronica stood at the tall iron wrought gates, her fingers lingering on the cool bars. The historic Charleston home sprawled in front of her, its grand facade a mixture of faded grandeur and quiet resilience. She could feel the weight of its history, of the many layers of paint and stone, beneath the modern comforts she had brought inside. She had designed it herself decades ago, a timeless blend of classic architecture and sleek contemporary lines. It was hers, all of it, deeded in her name, every inch a piece of her vision, her sacrifice, her labor. And yet, standing here now, the house felt more like a battleground than a home. Evan and Brielle had moved in, uninvited but unmistakably comfortable. They'd called it temporary, just until the wedding planning was over. That had been months ago, and now the house that had once been a sanctuary felt like a waiting room, full of noise, full of people, full of expectations that didn't belong to her. "Are you sure about this?" Marcus's voice broke through her thoughts, low and steady, but with a clear edge of concern. He stood beside her, his hands in his pockets, watching the house as though it, too, had betrayed him. "No contracts, no leases, no tenants' rights," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear, just hospitality. Veronica let out a soft, controlled breath. The words, familiar as they were, still pricked at her skin. She'd said them too, but they no longer felt like the guiding principle of her generosity. They felt like chains. She turned to him, meeting his gaze. "And hospitality has limits, Marcus?" The statement was a thread, taut and unspoken between them. He knew exactly what she meant. They both did. Evan had never been the kind of person to respect boundaries. Not when it came to things he wanted. He was a user, a taker. And Brielle too, sweet and pretty on the outside, but with her own quiet agenda beneath the surface. They had slowly, quietly made the house theirs, piece by piece, until it no longer felt like Veronica's home at all. She could hear their laughter echoing in the halls, their endless plans for wedding details that would have made any other mother proud, but only made Veronica feel more isolated, more invisible. Nev had warned her, "Are you really going to do something?" Isla's voice had a cutting sharpness to it, like the edge of a knife that knew how to find the softest spot. She stood nearby, arms crossed, watching Veronica with an intensity that was both familiar and unsettling. Veronica's gaze flickered over her shoulder, a wisp of tension pulling through her chest. It was hard to ignore Isla now, harder still to pretend that the choices she made didn't carry weight. She had come this far, farther than most would dare to go. And yet, there was still something in her that hesitated, something in her that questioned whether she was allowed to take the next step, to set boundaries that had never truly existed before. Veronica's voice was calm, deliberate, but there was a fire behind it that wasn't there before. "I already did." Isla flinched. Just a little, a shift in posture, the barest flicker of disbelief in her eyes. "You're going to make them leave?" There was a moment of stillness, as if the world had momentarily stopped spinning. Isla's question hung in the air, as though Veronica could decide, right then and there, whether to pull the rug out from under Evan and Brielle, or let them stay until they were ready to leave on their own terms. But Veronica didn't need to make a decision. She already had. The letter was already on its way, delivered with a calmness that belied the storm brewing inside her. There would be no more polite gestures, no more temporary arrangements, no more hospitality. The house wasn't a waiting room, and it wasn't a place for anyone to take without giving something back. Isla's face softened, just a little. She didn't say anything more. But Veronica could see the quiet approval in her gaze, the acknowledgement that this was no small decision. It was a stand. A declaration that Veronica wasn't a placeholder in her own life, not anymore. The door to the house creaked open in the distance, a small figure emerging onto the porch. Brielle. Her smile, wide and warm, could have melted anyone else, But Veronica saw through it, past the pretensions, to the quietly held expectation that Veronica would just let it happen. But Veronica's heart steadied as she looked at the woman standing in the doorway. Brielle was already moving toward the edge of the property, but this time, it felt different. Veronica wasn't watching from the sidelines anymore. The letter was on its way. The end of one chapter was already written, and with it, a new story was about to begin. The invoice was a cold, stark thing that sat on the kitchen counter, a reminder of the line that had been crossed, the thin veneer of civility that had been shattered. Veronica's fingers hovered over the paper, tracing the name at the top. Client, Veronica Hale. She had paid for everything, the food, the music, the decor, every last detail of the engagement party that had taken up space in her home, her life, for what felt like months. She had done it with the quiet grace that had always come naturally to her, assuming, at least for a fleeting moment, that this would be enough, that her involvement, her generosity, would be recognized. But then Brielle posted the picture. The caption was as sweet and saccharine as anything Veronica had expected. Couldn't have done this without our amazing families. The word families hung in the air, a delicate lie wrapped in the perfect bow of social media polish. Brielle's photo was carefully staged, a soft glow from the lights casting a warmth over the faces of everyone who mattered in the world she wanted to project. Brielle, of course, tagged her mother, only her mother. Not a whisper of Veronica's name, not even a nod to the woman who had financed the entire event. The sting of it settled in Veronica's chest, sharp and quick. She stood there in the quiet kitchen, staring at the post on her phone, and for the first time, it was hard to breathe. She had done everything right. She had given. And yet, in the world that Brielle was trying to create, her efforts didn't exist. Niamh, who had been watching from the doorway, stepped forward slowly, her presence soft yet unyielding. She had already seen the post, too, had already read between the lines of Brielle's picture-perfect facade. "Want me to clarify it for her?" Niamh asked, her voice low, just above a whisper. The offer was there, a hint of her own brand of fierce loyalty. But Veronica, despite the heat rising in her chest, shook her head slowly, her lips pressed tight. "No," she replied, her voice steady but sharp, the weight of her resolve clear in each word. "But I'll send the next one directly." Niamh didn't argue, but there was something unsaid between them, something that passed in the tension of the room. Veronica had long ago stopped being a figure in the background of this family. She was the one who made things happen, the one who supported and organized, but not anymore. No more behind the scenes. She had given too much, and it was time to claim her place. She turned from the kitchen counter, her fingers still wrapped around the invoice, and walked toward the study, where Marcus was already seated, his brow furrowed in concentration. She had called him earlier, after Brielle's post had cut through her like a blade. He had understood immediately. "I've started drafting the formal notice," Marcus said without looking up, his voice smooth, professional. "It's a standard procedure. They'll have 30 days to vacate." Veronica nodded, her mind already shifting gears. The house had never felt like hers in the way it should have. Not with them there. Not with Evan's easy disregard for boundaries, Brielle's absence of gratitude. It was time to take back what had been taken without permission. She glanced down at the paper in Marcus's hand, the legal jargon swirling before her eyes. She had been generous, she had been patient, but now she was done. Isla, who had been silent up until now, looked at Veronica with something softer in her gaze than usual. She was leaning against the doorway, arms crossed, eyes flicking from Veronica to Marcus and back. "What about Dad?" Isla asked, her voice quieter, more attentive than Veronica had expected. Veronica turned to look at her, a sharpness in her eyes. The question stung, but there was no surprise in it. The silence had stretched too long between her and her ex-husband. A silence that said everything about the man he had been, about the kind of father he had been, about the years of promises broken. "He should have laughed quieter," Veronica said, her tone flat, the words rolling off her tongue as if they no longer carried any weight. Isla's face shifted, her eyes narrowing slightly as though trying to figure out what was being left unsaid. Veronica could feel the years of resentment, of quiet frustration, rising like a tide. Her ex-husband's absence wasn't just a matter of geography. It was a silence, a void that had echoed through every decision, every sacrifice Veronica had made. But she didn't have to explain it, not to Isla, not to anyone. With a final glance at Marcus, Veronica felt her resolve solidify. There would be no more waiting, no more pretending that things would change on their own. The invoice, the post, the house, these were all pieces of the puzzle that had finally come together. A house that was hers, a life that was hers. And this time, she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. The doorbell rang, the sound sharp and insistent, as though the universe was demanding her attention. Veronica straightened, her fingers still pressed against the edge of the desk. This was it. The moment everything shifted, she took a deep breath, her heart steadied, and turned toward the door. The venue was an old grand building nestled on the edge of Charleston, its stone walls speaking of history, of moments long past. Veronica had reserved it years ago, back when her dreams were still intertwined with Isla's. She had planned it for Isla's wedding, even before Isla had a partner, before the engagement ring was slipped onto her finger. It had been a quiet gesture, a hold on something that would mark a future she imagined, a promise she would make to her daughter. The venue was special to her, its charm, not just in its beauty, but in the idea it symbolized. A future event, a legacy of family. The reservation was in Veronica's name, and no one, she believed, would ever challenge it, until they did. Brielle and Valerie, seemingly unaware of the delicate thread that held it all together, decided to book the venue for their own wedding. It was a bold move, one that Veronica would never have expected from them, except she should have. The audacity of their request, their entitlement, was a quiet slap to the face. It felt like an intrusion, as if their world had already taken over everything. Even the spaces she'd claimed for herself were now up for grabs. Veronica had expected the call from the venue's coordinator. She hadn't been surprised when the rejection came swiftly. Brielle and Valerie's request was politely declined. She didn't need to lift a finger. The phone sat on the edge of her desk, buzzing lightly with the notifications of their messages. Brielle had sent an innocent inquiry, her tone dripping with sweetness. "We were wondering if the venue was available for our date. The timing is perfect for us, and it would mean so much to have your blessing." The words stung more than Veronica cared to admit. A request for permission? No. It was a demand, wrapped in politeness, designed to soften the blow of taking what didn't belong to them. Veronica didn't respond. She simply set her phone aside and continued to sip the coffee that had gone cold in her mug. It was a small personal victory, one that wouldn't be acknowledged, not by anyone who mattered. Marcus, ever the pragmatic one, had seen the message too. "Want to release the venue?" he asked, his voice low, as if he already knew the answer. Veronica didn't even look at him. She had heard the question enough times in the past weeks, from him and from Neve, who had begun to sense the subtle undercurrents of the conflict. They were both waiting, wondering if she'd finally snap, if the pressure would build until it broke her. But it wasn't about releasing the venue. It wasn't about being generous anymore. It was about the principle of it. "No," Veronica replied, her voice soft but firm. "Let it breathe." There was power in letting things simmer, in giving people just enough room to realize what they had taken for granted. The venue wasn't just a building. It was a reminder that some things had been fought for, held on to, long before they ever had a chance to claim it. The longer they waited, the longer they would wonder. A few days passed. The silence between them all grew heavier, a waiting game, as Brielle and Valerie finally realized that the venue was out of their reach. But the tension didn't dissipate. Instead, it only intensified, like the stillness before a storm. Then came Valerie's phone call to the venue's director. Veronica had anticipated it. Valerie would pull strings, she always did. She had her way with people, with the subtle manipulations that always seemed to work in her favor. She was used to getting what she wanted, but this time it was different. The answer she received was clear, direct, and somehow final. "Ms. Hale has lifetime rights to the venue," the coordinator had said, his voice warm but unyielding. There was no room for negotiation. "I'm afraid we can't release it for your wedding." Veronica could almost picture Valerie's expression, the the way her jaw tightened, how her perfect poise would falter just for a second. But Valerie never let it show. Instead, she would have thanked the coordinator, her voice still sweet, still smooth. Yet the message was clear. This wasn't something she could control, no matter how much she tried to push. Veronica let herself exhale slowly as she leaned back in her chair. She didn't need to see it happen to know how it played out. There was power in the quiet moments, the ones where the control was in her hands, and no amount of charm or manipulation could change the reality of what had been set in motion long ago. The phone buzzed again. A new message from Brielle, this one more direct than before. "Can we talk about this? It's important." Veronica's finger hovered over the screen. She could feel the pull of the message, the need to reply, to address the issue head-on. She could almost hear Brielle's voice on the other end, desperate to twist things in her favor, to gain Veronica's approval. But Veronica didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, she picked up her phone and dialed Marcus. "Start drafting the letter," she said, her voice steady. "We need a new timeline. The next phase begins now." The house, the venue, the small gestures of control, they were all pieces in a larger game, and Veronica wasn't about to let anyone else dictate the rules. Not anymore. As the clock ticked onward, she felt the shift in the air, like the first drop of rain before the storm. The game was about to change, and this time, she was the one holding the cards. Evan arrived with his usual quiet intensity, his posture tight, his jaw set in that way he had when he was bracing for conflict. The air between them had shifted, and Veronica could feel it the moment she saw him walking down the driveway, his figure framed against the overcast sky. He had arrived on his own, not with Brielle, not with the quiet comfort of the life he had built in her house. He walked toward her, and Veronica didn't move from her place by the door. She didn't need to. She had already prepared for this moment, for his inevitable confrontation. It was the one thing she had known would come, ever since the first question he'd asked her all those years ago. "What's yours is mine, right?" "Why are you doing this?" His voice was tight, and even though the words weren't loud, they carried the weight of accusation. Veronica looked at him, eyes steady, face unreadable. "I'm not doing anything," she said, her voice smooth but with a cool edge. "Just ending the misunderstanding." The words fell between them, cutting through the tension in the room like a quiet, lethal weapon. This wasn't an attack. This wasn't a battle. This was simply the end of a very long, drawn-out process. Evan's eyes flickered to the small desk behind her, where a single document lay. The deed. His eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flashing in them. He was waiting for the punchline, for her to finally offer an explanation he could twist into something that made sense. Veronica walked to the desk without saying another word. Her movements were deliberate, measured. She picked up the deed and held it out to him, her fingers brushing over the paper before she handed it to him with a single, steady motion. He took it, hesitating, then scanning the document quickly, his brow furrowed as the words sank in. "I'm the sole owner of the property," Veronica said simply, her voice devoid of drama, of any emotional charge. "Paid in full." The silence that followed felt like it lasted too long. Evan's eyes flicked over the document again, and then back to her, his gaze hardening with something between disbelief and resentment. His lips parted as if he was about to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Behind her, the door opened just slightly, and Marcus stepped in, his presence calming but firm. He didn't need to say much. The moment was already in motion. "This is a courtesy conversation," Marcus said, his tone professional but with an undercurrent of finality. Nothing more. Evan shifted uncomfortably, the edges of his frustration now turning into something sharper. He didn't respond to Marcus. Instead, his focus remained entirely on Veronica. The words he had been holding back all this time seemed ready to spill over, but they didn't. Instead, his posture shifted. And for the first time in years, Veronica saw the vulnerability in her son, raw and exposed. "I raised a son," she said, her voice unyielding, cutting through the tension between them. Not a spectator. The statement hit harder than she intended. It was the truth, the very core of everything she had been trying to say for months. She had given him everything. She had shaped him into someone capable of standing on his own, of taking responsibility for the choices he made. But instead, he had let the world take from him, let the weight of his relationships with Brielle and Valerie cloud his judgment, his autonomy. Evan's face paled. His gaze flickered between the deed, her face, and the words he had no response for. He took a step back, as if recoiling from the gravity of the situation. The walls he had built, the justifications and excuses he had hidden behind, crumbled in an instant. For a moment, the world around them seemed to hold its breath. Veronica didn't soften her gaze. She didn't need to. The truth had been laid bare, and there was no place for argument, no room for negotiation. The property was hers. The decision had been made. She had never expected him to understand, to accept it without resistance, but she had hoped, in the quietest corners of herself, that he would see it for what it was. A line drawn, a boundary that had to be set, no matter the cost. Evan stood there for a moment longer, his lips pressed tight, his fists clenched by his sides. The storm inside him swirled, but he didn't say a word. There was nothing left to say, and he knew it. With a final, lingering look at her, at the life that had once been his, Evan turned and left. His footsteps echoed through the hallway, distant and hollow, until the door clicked softly behind him. Veronica stood still for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. The house felt quieter now, almost peaceful, as if the weight of his departure had cleared the air. But there was still something left unsaid, something left to face. The calm before the storm hadn't fully broken. Not yet. And Veronica was ready. Brielle's eyes scanned the papers laid out before her, frustration written across her face. She had spent hours poring over them, leafing through old files and records, each one telling her the same story. Nothing. No shared ownership. No hidden clause that would give her access to the house she thought should be hers. By virtue of association, of belonging, of a life half lived there. She slammed the papers down on the desk, the sound sharp against the otherwise quiet room. The documents were meticulous, each piece marked with Veronica's name, each signature hers alone. The more Brielle looked, the less she found. The realization settled in slowly, like cold water seeping into her bones. There was nothing here that could be used to force Veronica's hand. No loopholes, no forgotten agreements. Brielle felt a lump rise in her throat, but she forced it down. She wasn't about to give up. Not now, not when it felt so close. She pulled out her phone and dialed Valerie's number. The call rang twice before Valerie picked up, her voice crisp and sharp. "What is it?" Valerie asked, already irritated by the sound of Brielle's silence. Brielle's voice was tight, forced through clenched teeth. "There's nothing. It's all in her name. No joint ownership, no inheritance, nothing." The words fell between them like bricks, and for a moment, there was silence on the other end. Valerie's fury was palpable, even across the phone line. Brielle could practically hear the air shift as Valerie's anger coiled tight. "She's playing games with us," Valerie snapped. "That house should have been ours. I deserve it. We deserve it." Brielle closed her eyes, the weight of her mother's words sinking into her chest. Deserve. The word had come up again, like a mantra they both clung to. This belief that the things they wanted were theirs by right. That family meant claiming what was owed to them, without question, without hesitation. "I'm not giving up," Brielle said, her voice a little weaker than she intended. But then, as if her own resolve faltered, she added, "Maybe we can buy it from her." Valerie was quiet for a beat too long before she spoke. "I'll handle it. Let me make a call." The next day, Marcus sat behind his desk, looking over some papers when the phone rang. He hadn't expected the call, but he'd known it was coming. Valerie had a way of forcing issues into being, of turning negotiations into something she could control. "I'd like to offer you a buyout," Valerie's voice came through the line, cold and clipped. "A fair one. We'll pay what's needed to make this transition smooth." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the edge of the desk. He hadn't moved in response, hadn't shifted in his position. Valerie's offer, though generous by her standards, was nothing more than a business transaction to her. No regard for what the house meant, for the memories it held. "I'm afraid I'll have to decline," Marcus said, his tone smooth, polite, and final. "This isn't about money." He didn't offer an explanation, didn't need to. The words were simple and absolute. "This isn't for sale." Valerie was silent for a moment. He could imagine her on the other end, her lips tightening as she fumed. But there was no follow-up, no further argument. She simply hung up, and Marcus was left staring at the phone in his hand. Isla, who had been watching this quiet war unfold from the sidelines, finally broke the silence. She entered the room where Veronica was seated, the edges of a family heirloom carefully wrapped in soft tissue paper. She watched Veronica's hands, steady and sure as she packed the fragile objects with precision. "They think everything's a transaction," Isla murmured, leaning against the doorframe. Her voice was tired, a quiet acknowledgement of the way Brielle and Valerie approached life, as if nothing mattered unless it had an exchange attached. Veronica didn't look up, her focus entirely on the box before her, but she felt Isla's presence behind her like a quiet support. "Because they never had to build anything from scratch," Veronica replied, her voice flat but sharp with the weight of her own history. "They've always had things handed to them, but it's never been about the work. Not for them." She lifted another fragile item from the shelf, a silver-framed photo, now fading with age, and gently placed it in the box. Each piece, each memory, was carefully packed away. Her family's history, the legacy of effort and sacrifice, was being stored. Only Isla would have access to it. She would be the one to carry forward the threads Veronica had spent a lifetime weaving. Isla moved closer, watching her mother, as if the quiet act of packing was a slow, deliberate goodbye. Veronica had already known what would happen next. The house would no longer be a place of negotiation or subtle compromises. It was time for her to reclaim what was hers, and to offer the pieces of her past only to the one who would understand them. When the box was packed, Veronica stood and closed the lid with a firm finality. She glanced up at Isla, a slight but meaningful look passing between them. "This is yours now," Veronica said, her voice steady. It wasn't a gift. It was a passing of responsibility, a legacy. Isla nodded, her eyes heavy with understanding, but there was something else there too, something that Veronica could only recognize as the first flicker of recognition. Isla had seen what she had sacrificed. She had seen the quiet ways Veronica had worked to hold the family together, and now, it was Isla's turn to hold the weight of the family's past. The doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, pulling them both from their quiet moment. Veronica didn't move immediately, but Isla's gaze shifted toward the door, knowing what would come next. Veronica exhaled slowly, the weight of everything that had happened settling like dust around her. "Let's see who it is," she said softly. And as the doorbell rang again, there was a finality to the sound that felt like the end of something that had been coming for a long time. The envelope sat on the kitchen counter, pristine and official. Its bold red lettering screamed urgency, the kind that couldn't be ignored. The certified eviction packet, 30 days. The notice, cold and detached, was nothing more than a formality. Veronica had already made her decision, and now it was written in ink, signed, and sealed. There was no turning back. She had waited for this moment, but now, standing in the silence of the house, it felt strangely final, as if a door had closed behind her, and she was left standing in the quiet aftermath of something irrevocable. Evan arrived first. His footsteps were heavier than usual, his gait tense, the sound of his shoes clicking against the hardwood echoing through the hallway. He stepped into the kitchen, his eyes already scanning the room, landing on the packet. He didn't speak at first. His gaze lingered on the envelope, the words printed so plainly, as if they were some impersonal, bureaucratic fact of life. It didn't seem real to him, not yet. Finally, he picked it up, turning it in his hands before looking at Veronica. His face tight with a mixture of disbelief and frustration. "You really did it," he said, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Veronica didn't flinch. Her face remained still, eyes calm as she met his gaze. "It's legal, not personal." The words were simple, but they carried weight. She didn't need to explain herself further. There was no more room for negotiation. The decision had been made. Evan didn't respond right away. He glanced down at the letter again, his fingers twitching as if he wanted to tear it up, to argue his way out of it. But there was nothing to say. He had crossed a line, and now there was no way to uncross it. He exhaled, the sound heavy with resignation. "This is about the house, isn't it?" he asked, his voice cracking just slightly as the layers of frustration, anger, and regret all bubbled to the surface. Veronica didn't answer, not in the way he expected. She didn't need to. The truth hung between them, unspoken and undeniable. It wasn't just about the house, it was about respect. It was about boundaries that had been ignored, promises broken, and years of silence finally coming to a head. Evan shifted on his feet, his shoulders slumping slightly. He opened his mouth to speak again, but Veronica cut him off with a simple glance, a look that told him everything he needed to know. She had made her decision, and nothing was going to change that. Without another word, he turned and left, the door clicking shut behind him with the faintest echo, leaving Veronica standing alone in the quiet aftermath. Upstairs, Isla had begun packing. The sound of boxes being filled with clothes, books, and trinkets was a quiet, measured rhythm. She didn't make a sound, didn't ask questions. She simply moved through the motions, the reality of what had happened settling over her like a quiet, steady weight. She didn't look for comfort. She didn't need it. This was her choice, too. Downstairs, the phone buzzed. Neve's name flashed on the screen. Veronica picked it up, not bothering to check the message. She already knew what it would say. "Everyone's talking. You want to say something?" Neve's words came through quickly, with that familiar sense of urgency. Veronica stared at the message, her thumb hovering over the screen. She could say something. She could respond to the questions, to the whispers that would inevitably follow. But in that moment, she realized something. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to validate her choices. The notice had already spoken for her. "No," Veronica typed back, her fingers moving decisively. "Just hold the date." The date. It was always there, just waiting for the right moment. The day the decision was made, the day everything changed. She had set the date for a reason, because it was the day that would mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Outside, the house felt still, almost too quiet. The air felt thick with expectation, the kind of silence that lingers before something monumental happens. She could feel it. The weight of everything that had led to this moment, every choice, every sacrifice, every word unsaid. And now there was nothing left but to let it unfold. She glanced at the calendar on the wall. The date she had set for this moment, the moment she had known would come, when she would finally take control, was circled in red. It was more than just a deadline. It was a line in the sand. Veronica stood, her gaze steady, her resolve unshakable. The storm had passed, and now there was only the calm before everything that was yet to come. The letter from the venue arrived quietly, folded neatly and sealed with the kind of precision that suggested nothing was left to chance. It was addressed directly to Brielle, but Veronica knew she'd be the one to receive it first. The message inside was as formal as it was pointed. "Due to a recent conflict of interest, we are revoking your visitation privileges, effective immediately. We appreciate your understanding." Beneath the words was a subtle yet unmistakable implication that the board, under Veronica's influence, had decided the matter long before it was formalized. The venue was no longer a place for Brielle to roam freely. Not while Veronica's donation controlled the board. Not while the history of the building was still bound by the legacy Veronica had ensured. Veronica folded the letter neatly, placing it on her desk with a quiet sense of finality. It wasn't a blow she had dealt directly, but it was one that landed all the same. Brielle had always assumed access, assumed she could be a part of every piece of Veronica's world, without understanding the price of that belonging. But now, the price had been made clear. Brielle, of course, didn't take it well. She had spent the next few hours venting her frustration to her friends, speaking in half-formed sentences, in clipped words that were more venom than venting. Her anger boiled over. Her voice pitched higher as she told them the story. Her version, of course, twisting the narrative into one of unfairness, of being wronged by the system. "I've been treated like an outsider," she fumed, pacing around her apartment. "Like I don't have a right to any of it. She can't just do this. It's mine too." Her friends listened, their nods more out of politeness than understanding, until one of them, after a few hesitant seconds, spoke the truth she refused to hear. But Brielle, it's not yours. Not really. Not the way you think. That was the moment it clicked for her. The realization that the pieces of the world she had always taken for granted were slipping through her fingers. But the message, as sharp and clear as it was, didn't sink in. Instead, Brielle doubled down, growing louder, more dramatic in her complaints, her frustration spilling out like a wave that couldn't be contained. Meanwhile, Valerie, never one to accept what she couldn't control, took a more direct approach. Her response came swiftly, a call to the press, a threat of a lawsuit. Discrimination, she said. She accused Veronica of using her position to undermine Brielle's future, to block her access to what was rightfully hers. The legalese was thick, the tone icy, as if the world would bend to Valerie's demands. But Veronica knew better. She'd been in this fight long enough to recognize when to let the noise play out. The lawsuit, of course, never came. It was dismissed with a polite, impersonal note from Veronica's lawyer, and it vanished just as quickly as it had appeared. No one was listening to Valerie, not now, not when Veronica's name carried the weight it did. But Veronica had other moves in mind. The following week, she donated another $25,000 to the venue's preservation fund. This time, she did it quietly, under Isla's name. The venue, the place that had once been the backdrop to a future she had imagined for Isla, now had a deeper connection to her daughter. The donation was symbolic, a gesture that spoke not just to preservation but to continuity. Isla's name would be forever attached to the place, not Brielle's, not Valerie's. As Veronica signed the donation papers, she felt the last of the loose ends of her past tighten into place. Brielle's anger would burn itself out. Valerie's threats would fall flat, and Isla would be the one who would carry the legacy forward. The transition, as always, would happen on Veronica's terms. A week later, Marcus entered her study, his face slightly more focused than usual. He laid down a thick stack of papers on the desk, the final version of something they had been working on for months. "Trust documents are finalized," he said, his voice neutral, as though he knew the importance of what had been decided. "Isla now holds controlling interest in the property after your passing." Veronica looked at the papers, the weight of them settling over her like the quiet finality of a book's last chapter. Isla would be the one to decide the future of the house, the one to manage it when Veronica was no longer there to hold the strings. Veronica hadn't had to think twice about the decision. Isla had always understood the value of hard work, of sacrifice. She would know how to carry this legacy forward. Brielle and Valerie would have their entitlement, their demands, but Isla would be the one who understood the real cost. She would be the one to decide what came next. With the paperwork finalized, Veronica sat back in her chair and sighed. The quiet of the room was different now. The storm had passed, and the dust had settled. The legacy she had built, piece by piece, would endure. But it would not be inherited by just anyone. It would go to the one who could carry it, the one who knew what it meant to make something last. The doorbell rang again, sharp and insistent. Veronica's gaze flickered toward the door, her fingers still resting on the edge of the papers, as if they were the last of something important. The weight of everything, every choice, every sacrifice, hung in the balance. With a final, steadying breath, Veronica stood, her eyes meeting Isla's. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. But this next chapter, the one where everything was about to change, was now in motion. And the future, at least this one, would be hers to write. The feature ran in the local magazine with the kind of fanfare only a story like Veronica's could command. The woman who rebuilt the district, Veronica Hale. The headline alone was enough to make people stop and take notice, the words bold and unapologetic. The photograph accompanying the article showed Veronica standing tall on the porch of the very house that had once been the scene of so many quiet insults, of moments where she had felt the sting of being an outsider in her own life. She stood there now, proud and unflinching, her posture strong, her eyes direct. There was no hint of the hesitation that had once defined her. In that image, she was a woman who had finally taken control, who had rewritten the narrative. The article delved into her history, her role in transforming not just the district but the entire community. It spoke of the risks she had taken, the battles she had fought, and the quiet strength with which she had reshaped her surroundings. Veronica's name had become synonymous with resilience. People spoke of her as if she were an institution, as if her very presence had stabilized everything around her. And in a way, it had. She had built something here, something that would last long after she was gone. The piece also touched on her daughter, Isla, with the kind of reverence that felt like a final passing of the torch. Isla Hale, intern and future steward of the Hale legacy, the article said, framing Isla's place in the story not just as Veronica's daughter, but as the heir to everything Veronica had worked for. The language was deliberate, careful, nothing was left to chance. Isla's future was assured, and this public acknowledgement made it clear to everyone that the transition had already begun. It was no longer Veronica's story alone. Isla had already begun to carry it forward. The story would run in print and online, circulating through the hands of those who still held influence, those who had once questioned Veronica's place in their world. But now, no one could deny it. She had earned her spot. And Isla's future was already written, not as a footnote, but as a continuation of the legacy Veronica had carved out with her own hands. In the living room, Valerie sat with the magazine in her hands, the glossy pages turned in front of her. She didn't say a word, not at first. Her eyes skimmed over the article, over the photos, over the words that spoke not just of Veronica's power, but of Isla's future. The weight of it pressed down on her, and for the first time, there was no fight in her. She was silent, simply absorbing it, as though the world had shifted beneath her and there was no place left to stand. The house, the venue, the power, it was all slipping further from her reach, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Evan, too, had been affected by the article. His phone rang constantly throughout the day, his name flashing on the screen as calls from donors and business associates poured in. "Is it true?" they asked, their voices filled with disbelief, as though they couldn't comprehend the extent of Veronica's influence. "Is it true that Isla is taking over?" The questions came in waves, and Evan could only offer half-hearted answers. The truth was too much for him to process, too much for him to control. He stood in the hallway, the phone pressed to his ear, the weight of the conversation hanging like a cloud. The calls were polite, but the undercurrent of something else was unmistakable. People weren't just surprised. They were unsettled. They didn't know how to navigate the changes that Veronica had set in motion. How could they? She had rewritten the terms of everything, and now they had no choice but to follow along. Meanwhile, Brielle, in a moment of frustration, opened her phone and pulled up her wedding planning Instagram. The pictures of dreamy venues, of lace and flowers, all the things she had once imagined were now hollow, meaningless. She had spent so much time curating a version of herself that fit into the world she thought she could inherit, only to have it ripped out from under her. Her fingers hovered over the app, and then, with a single swipe, she deleted the account. All of it, gone. The curated version of her life, the one that had so carefully constructed her place in the world, was no longer hers to hold. It felt like the final nail in the coffin of everything she had assumed was hers. She had been part of the story, but it was no longer the story she wanted to tell. As she sat there in the dim light of the evening, the silence in the house felt different now. It was no longer a quiet space filled with uncertainty. It was a space of transition, of endings and beginnings. Veronica had already claimed her future, already built something that would outlast everyone else's plans. And as the house stood still around them, its walls heavy with the weight of its own history, the future was now in motion. Valerie may have fought, Evan may have been confused, and Brielle may have run from it all, but Veronica knew the truth. The story had already written itself, and now all she had to do was let it unfold. The movers arrived early, their boots scraping the hardwood as they moved through the house with practiced efficiency. The house that had been so full of noise, of arguments, of promises, of things left unsaid, was now eerily silent. The boxes piled up like a small mountain in the living room, each one destined for a truck that would carry it all away, piece by piece. The house was emptying, and with it, the memories that had once filled its rooms. Valerie arrived just as the movers were preparing the final load. her heels clicking sharply on the floor as she stepped into the foyer. Her presence was as commanding as ever. Though her smile was tighter, more brittle, she moved toward the movers like a conductor directing an orchestra, her hands fluttering through the air as she tried to assert some sort of control over the process. "Not that one," she said, pointing at a box marked with the word kitchen in bold black letters. "That needs to go into the garage." She moved toward a small, delicate mirror hanging on the wall. "And this stays," she added, her fingers brushing against the glass. "It's not going anywhere." Marcus, standing nearby, stepped forward, his expression cool but firm. "That's not going with you," he said. "The fixtures, the built-ins, they're part of the home. You're not taking them." Valerie's eyes narrowed, the faintest flicker of disbelief crossing her face. She opened her mouth to protest, but Marcus's expression never changed. He didn't need to raise his voice to assert control. The message was clear. There would be no more negotiations, no more bending the rules to fit her whims. The tension between them simmered for a moment, but Valerie didn't argue. Instead, she shot him a look of disdain and moved away, her heels clicking sharply as she walked through the now barren rooms. Veronica didn't appear. She didn't need to. She was elsewhere, far from the scene that had once been hers to control. She had chosen not to participate in the moving process. There was nothing left for her to prove. Instead, she was at lunch with Isla and Neve. The quiet hum of their conversation a stark contrast to the chaos that was unfolding at the house. They didn't speak about the house or the move, not directly. But there was something in the air between them, something unspoken. Isla's future had already been decided, and with it, a shift in the legacy Veronica had spent years crafting. Back at the house, the final pieces were being packed away, the walls growing emptier, quieter with every passing minute. Evan stood in the empty doorway, his figure silhouetted against the light streaming in from outside. He hadn't said much all morning, not to Valerie, not to anyone. He was standing there, as though waiting for something, waiting for the house to somehow come back to life, waiting for some sense of clarity to emerge from the hollow space. Valerie came up beside him, her hands folding together in front of her like she was holding on to some final shred of dignity. "We'll rebuild," she said, her voice soft but determined. Evan didn't look at her right away. His eyes remained fixed on the empty space, as though he were searching for something that wasn't there. Then, slowly, he turned his head toward her, the expression on his face unreadable. "With what?" he asked, the question low and almost tired, like a weary confession. The weight of it hung in the air, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. Valerie opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. She stood there, her chest rising and falling with a sharp breath. Rebuilding. Rebuilding what? What had they really lost? And what had they truly built? All the plans, all the expectations, where had they led them? The movers were finishing up now, their steps light in the silence of the room. Evan's eyes drifted past Valerie to the walls, to the empty frames and bare floors. Nothing looked the same, not anymore. Just as the last of the movers were leaving, Isla entered. She walked through the front door, quiet and purposeful, her gaze skimming the room. She didn't seem surprised by the emptiness, not at first. Instead, she walked straight toward the hallway where the family heirlooms had been stored, where Veronica had made her quiet decision to leave everything behind for Ayla. In her hand, she held a single sheet of paper, a note, written hastily but with purpose. She didn't say anything to Evan or Valerie as she passed them, her footsteps light on the floor. She paused for only a moment in the hall before placing the note on the kitchen counter where her mother had once stood. "I'm staying with Grandma," the note said. The words were simple, unadorned. There was no explanation, no apology, just the quiet truth of it. As Isla walked out of the house, leaving behind a life she had outgrown, she left nothing behind except a single, unspoken decision. The weight of it settled over the room, leaving Valerie and Evan standing in its wake, the door slowly closing behind Isla's retreating figure. And as Veronica's legacy shifted into the hands of the one who understood its value, the house stood still, silent, waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The letter arrived a week after the move. It was as formal and final as the one that had started it all, yet there was something distinctly different about this one. Isla's name was now boldly inked at the top, the paper crisp and untouched by time. Isla Hale is hereby named as the future owner of the Hale estate and donor rights, the letter began, the weight of its words settling like a stone in her chest. Upon the passing of Veronica Hale, Isla Hale will assume full control of the Hale legacy and properties. The words didn't surprise Isla. She had known this was coming, had known that her mother would trust her to carry on the work, to manage the foundation that had once been her life's singular focus. But now it was official. She wasn't just a part of the story, she was the story's future. She folded the letter carefully, setting it aside on the desk in the study. This wasn't just about ownership, it was about responsibility. Veronica had built something remarkable, something that had affected not just their family, but the entire community. Isla had been watching, learning. She had seen the intricate ways her mother had pulled the strings, had shaped the landscape of the district. And now it was her turn to take the reins. It started small, just a few of Veronica's smaller properties. Isla began managing them part-time, a way for her to dip her toes into the responsibility that had been thrust upon her. She'd set up meetings with tenants, reviewed maintenance reports, dealt with contractors. The work was meticulous, demanding more of her time than she'd expected. But it felt good. It felt right. Each call, each decision, reinforced her place in this new world Veronica had crafted. But not everyone was on board with this transition. Brielle, still grappling with the aftermath of everything that had happened, began sending messages to Isla, texts, emails, voicemails, all with the same insistence. "We need to talk. I don't understand what's happening." Isla didn't answer any of them. She couldn't. Not yet. Brielle's words, her guilt-laden attempts at reconciliation, felt like empty gestures. Isla had watched her half-hearted attempts to claim what wasn't hers, seen how Brielle tried to fit herself into spaces that were never made for her. The messages stopped after a while, but the silence lingered. Valerie, however, was a different story. The day she confronted Evan, her words came with the sharpness of someone who had lost more than just a house. "You let her do this," Valerie said, her voice taut with barely concealed rage. "You let Isla take everything from us, from me." "This was supposed to be our life, Evan, not hers." Evan didn't answer. He stood there, staring out of the window, his back turned to her. The quiet stretched between them like a thread ready to snap. He didn't argue because he couldn't. He hadn't fought for it. He hadn't fought for anything. The house, the legacy. It had slipped through his fingers, just as easily as everything else in his life had. Valerie let out a bitter laugh. "I don't know why I ever thought we had a chance," she muttered, before storming out, her heels clicking sharply as she retreated from the space, from him. As the days passed, Isla settled into her role with a growing sense of assurance. The phone calls, the meetings, the constant decision-making. It became second nature. It felt right, even if it was more than she had ever imagined for herself. One afternoon, as she sat at the desk in the study, Veronica entered quietly, carrying a small box. She didn't say anything at first, just placed it gently on the desk before Isla. "Your grandfather's drafting pencils," Veronica said simply. "He used them for years. He would have wanted you to have them." Isla looked at the box, then back at her mother, her throat tight. She hadn't known what to expect, hadn't known what to do with all the weight of the inheritance, the legacy. But this was something she understood. These were tools that had helped shape the foundation of everything Veronica had built. And now they were hers to wield. "I'll make sure it's all worthy," Isla said softly, her fingers tracing the box as if it were fragile, as if she might break something if she wasn't careful. Veronica smiled. It was the first genuine smile Isla had seen from her in a while, and it made something shift in the air between them. Before leaving the room, Veronica paused at the door. "You're ready," she said quietly, but with such certainty that Isla felt the truth of it deep in her bones. Neve, who had always been a quiet presence in Isla's life, approached her later that day with an unexpected offer. "I've been thinking," Neve began, her voice always calm but with an underlying strength. "There's a position opening up with my firm. It's part-time, and I could use an assistant, someone with the kind of vision you're starting to develop." Isla hesitated. This wasn't just about the house or the properties. This was an opportunity, one that could help her develop in ways she hadn't anticipated. "I'll think about it," she said, her voice steady. As she stood by the window that night, looking out over the district her mother had reshaped, Isla felt the weight of the future settling on her shoulders. She wasn't just managing the past. She was shaping what would come next. The doorbell rang again, this time with a sense of urgency that pulled Isla from her thoughts. She could feel it, the shift in the air, the quiet expectation that something was about to happen. But Isla didn't move. Not yet. For the first time, she felt the quiet strength of her position, the heir to a legacy they couldn't touch. Veronica sat at her desk, her fingers resting lightly on the envelope. It had arrived earlier in the day, the faintest creases already visible in its once crisp paper. She hadn't opened it, not yet. She didn't need to. The letter was a reminder of everything that had come before and everything that had led to this moment. Instead, she reached for something else, tucked neatly inside a drawer. A letter she had kept for years, one Isla had written to her long ago. It was a simple note, the words scratched quickly across the page, but Veronica had never let it go. She had read it so many times, the edges now worn, the ink fading, but the sentiment remained as clear as ever. "You always saw me," the letter had read. Simple, raw, and true. She'd never needed grand gestures. Veronica had always known Isla was the one who would understand, not just in the ways that mattered, but in the quiet spaces between. The spaces where the world thought they were invisible. But Isla had never been invisible to her. Veronica set the letter down, her gaze lingering on the words. She hadn't replied to Isla that day, but she didn't need to. The meaning was clear between them. They didn't need more words. She stood up from her desk and walked to the window, her eyes scanning the grounds outside. The garden stretched wide before her, the roses now in full bloom. They were delicate, each petal soft, yet strong in its quiet resistance. She moved toward them, her steps slow and deliberate, each one purposeful as she worked through the rows, pruning the edges with care. There was something meditative about it, about tending to the life she had built here. Her fingers worked through the roses, removing what had withered, leaving only the thriving parts of the plants. In many ways, the garden had always mirrored her life, carefully pruned, thoughtfully shaped, yet wild in its own way. Veronica had made sure it flourished, just as she had made sure everything else in her life had. Behind her, Marcus entered quietly, his presence always steady, always sure. He had become a constant, just as reliable as the work she had done over the years. "The trust documents are updated," he said, his voice low, carrying a weight of its own. "Every detail is airtight. There's no way for anything to fall through." Veronica nodded without turning around. She could feel the change in the air, the certainty that everything she had built was now more than secure. The legacy would stand, unshakable. It was all in place. Isla's future, her place in the world, was no longer in question. Meanwhile, Valerie, having lost her hold on what she thought should be hers, tried to launch another wedding elsewhere. She made her calls, arranged meetings, but the venue she had hoped for, the one Veronica had once thought to be an option, was no longer available. When she went to secure donations, her name fell on deaf ears. The funds she thought would come in easily because of who she was, because of the connections she had once built on borrowed credibility, never materialized. No one cared anymore. They were tired of the games she had played. Veronica's name, and now Isla's, carried weight. Valerie's did not, but Veronica had the last word. She hadn't forgotten Brielle. It wasn't about revenge or spite. It was about influence, about making a statement that would last. Veronica funded a student grant at Brielle's former university, not under her own name, but under Isla's. It wasn't about handing something over to Brielle. It wasn't about her at all. It was about marking Isla's place, about making sure the world saw that she too was becoming someone who could affect change in the way Veronica had. The grant was a small gesture in the grand scheme of things, but to Veronica, it was everything. A way to take back the control, to rewrite what had been undone. Brielle's name would never touch the legacy Veronica had carefully crafted. But Isla's? That name would mean something. Later that evening, as the house quieted around her, Isla found Veronica sitting in the study, the day's work behind her. She stood still for a moment, watching her mother, the weight of the day settling between them. "You made a name mean something again," Isla said quietly, her voice low with awe, a sentiment that matched the weight of her own thoughts. Veronica didn't look up, but she could feel the truth in Isla's words. She had made something out of nothing, had carved a place for herself, for Isla, in a world that had always tried to keep them on the edges. "It's not just my name anymore," Veronica said, her voice steady. "It's yours now, too." And Isla, for the first time, understood what that truly meant. Not just a legacy, but a responsibility. Not just the right to stand on the shoulders of what had come before, but the chance to shape what came next. The quiet settled between them, but in that silence, something shifted. This was no longer just Veronica's story. It was Isla's too. And with it, a future that was hers to write. The Hale Grove. It wasn't just a name, it was a statement. The garden stood now, newly planted with trees and shrubs, the first of many to fill the quiet expanse of land that had once been simply a stretch of lawn. The rows of blossoms and the faint scent of soil beneath the sun were testament to Veronica's vision. It wasn't a garden born out of spite. It wasn't revenge. This was something she had cultivated for herself, and for Isla. It was a place that would grow, not from anger, but from the resilience of what had come before, and the quiet strength of what was yet to be. Veronica arrived at the dedication ceremony in a blue silk coat, the rich color of it soft against the dark green of the trees. The coat was one she had worn only a few times before, the fabric catching the light in the most delicate way, its elegance understated. She felt the weight of it all now, the ceremony, the crowd gathering around her, and yet she walked through it with ease. She had earned her place here. Isla stood at the podium, her presence a quiet but powerful force. She hadn't prepared much of a speech, but she didn't need to. She simply looked out at the crowd, at the garden that had been built, the grove that now stood as a legacy of what her mother had passed down. "Legacy is not who remembers you," Isla said, her voice steady and clear, every word ringing with intention. "It's who continues you." The silence that followed was reverent, as though the truth in those words settled deeply in the hearts of everyone gathered. Isla's eyes swept across the audience, some familiar faces, some strangers, but the truth in her words resonated with a strength that could not be ignored. Veronica stood at the back of the crowd, her gaze steady, her heart quietly full. This was Isla's moment, and yet it was her own as well. The press had arrived, the cameras clicking as Isla spoke. But Veronica wasn't concerned with the photos. She wasn't concerned with the headlines. This wasn't about the attention. It was about what had been built, what was continuing. It was about a legacy that didn't need to be shouted from rooftops, but quietly tended to, like the garden that now stretched out before her. Brielle found out online. Of course, she had seen the social media posts, the photos from the event, and the one that caught her attention most, the one with the caption, "The Hale Grove, a legacy of strength and resilience, rooted in the past, reaching for the future." Her reaction was immediate. Fury surged through her like a wildfire, igniting all the old resentments she had buried under the guise of wanting to belong. She spent the evening pacing through her apartment, her phone gripped tightly in her hand, trying to find the right words, but nothing came. She wanted to fight back, to make it hers, to make it all hers, but she couldn't. The words were gone, the fight dissipated in a haze of frustration, and then, after all that rage, there was only silence. Evan, meanwhile, had taken the quietest of exits. He had moved in with a friend, the weight of his choices too heavy to carry alone. He had packed up what little he owned and left the house, left the space that had once felt like his, now completely hollow. No goodbye, no fanfare, just the quiet click of the door behind him. He didn't want to stay, didn't want to fight. He didn't know where his place was anymore. And Valerie stopped speaking to both of them, to him and to Isla. She'd retreated into herself, the anger burning in her chest, but with no one left to direct it toward. She spent her days pretending everything was fine, pretending there was still some semblance of control. when really there was nothing left. She had built nothing, claimed nothing, except bitterness, and even that was fading with every passing day. Back at the house, Veronica returned after the ceremony, the weight of the event still hanging in the air. She was tired, but it was a tiredness that felt earned. She had stood on the sidelines for too long. Now, everything had come full circle, and there was nothing more to prove. She entered the house, the door creaking slightly as it closed behind her. The place felt different. It wasn't empty. It wasn't full either. It was just quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a storm passes, when the damage is done and everything has settled into its rightful place. She set her gloves down on the shelf, the soft leather feeling familiar against her fingertips. There was no bitterness left in the air, no regrets, only the quiet presence of a woman who had worked her entire life to shape something. And now it was Isla's turn to carry it. And as Veronica stood there, in the stillness of the house she had built, she felt the weight of everything that had passed between them, her, Isla, the others. It was over, but in that silence, in that moment of calm, she knew that the future was already in motion. The garden would grow, Isla would continue, and the legacy would last, far beyond any of them. The young girl stood in front of Veronica, her eyes wide with uncertainty, as she gently turned the pages of the notebook in her hands. She had been quiet for a long time, her gaze drifting over the pages filled with sketches of things that might have been dreams, buildings, landscapes, places that were yet to exist. But there was a hesitation, a lack of conviction in her movements, as though she wasn't sure whether she was allowed to dream so big. Veronica had watched her for a moment, taking in the quiet struggle. Then, with a soft but steady voice, she spoke. "Yes, I built it. And more." The words were simple, but they held a depth that reached beyond just the physical space they were standing in. She reached for a fresh page, sliding the notebook toward the girl. "Draw what you want to see someday," she added, her hand guiding the notebook between them. There was no hesitation in her touch. It was a gesture born of years spent creating, of carving out a future with steady hands. The girl looked down at the page, her fingers hovering over the blank canvas, but something shifted in her posture. The uncertainty began to fade as she traced the first gentle lines. Veronica watched her, the smile creeping across her lips, knowing this moment wasn't just about the drawings. It was about the promise that had been made. This space, this future, would be hers to shape. Isla, standing at a distance, observed quietly. She had seen this before, seen Veronica offer this unspoken gift of creation, of possibility. Her voice broke the silence gently, with a hint of recognition. "You're doing it again," Isla said, the words light but filled with meaning. There was no need for further explanation. She knew what her mother was doing. Veronica looked at her, her eyes softening. She didn't need to ask Isla to understand. They had always shared this quiet language, this way of seeing what others couldn't, what needed to be seen, what was waiting to be created. "Making space," Veronica replied, her voice steady, but a smile playing on her lips as she looked at her daughter. Isla nodded, her smile matching Veronica's. "And meaning." The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the porch. It was the kind of evening that made everything feel still, the edges of the world blurred in that perfect moment between day and night. The air was thick with the warmth of summer, but it was the kind of warmth that felt like peace, an easy peace that settled into the bones, where everything was in its place. The kind of peace that came with knowing that what had been built was not just about the walls and foundations, but about the meaning that had been etched into them. The girl kept drawing, the pages filling slowly with her thoughts, her future taking shape in quiet, confident strokes. Veronica stood there, watching her, feeling a quiet satisfaction in the space she had created, not just in the physical structures, but in the people who would inhabit them, the ones who would carry it forward. Isla moved to sit beside her mother, the two of them looking out at the garden, where the sun cast long shadows over the now thriving plants. For a moment, there was nothing more to say. The garden had been born from resilience, from the quiet strength of what had come before, and now it was a symbol of what was yet to be. The garden was just the beginning. As the sun dipped lower, the world grew softer, quieter. Veronica felt the weight of time passing, but it wasn't something that burdened her. It was a quiet acknowledgement that her work was not done, but it had already started. Isla, standing beside her, would continue it. She would carry what had been built, but she would also make it her own. The sound of footsteps broke the silence, and Neve appeared on the path, carrying a small envelope in her hand. She had been to the ceremony earlier, but there was something more she had wanted to do, something she hadn't said. She handed the envelope to Veronica with a simple smile. "A thank you note," Neve said, her tone warm but quiet, "for all you've done." Veronica took it, her fingers brushing against Neve's in a brief, comfortable touch. She didn't need to read the note to know the gratitude it held. She had already felt it in the quiet moments, in the way things had shifted, in the way the future was no longer uncertain. It was already unfolding. As Neve walked back down the path, Veronica opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the words. There were no grand declarations, no extravagant thanks, just a simple acknowledgement of what had been shared, what had been built. It was enough. Isla turned to her mother, watching the exchange, and Veronica, with the weight of the world quietly settling into her bones, smiled. She had given everything she could. And now, the future was in capable hands. The door to the next chapter had opened, and it was Isla's to walk through. The sun set completely then, leaving only the soft glow of dusk, and the world felt a little quieter, a little more certain. The legacy was now not just Veronica's, but Isla's, and in a way, the world had finally begun to catch up. Veronica stood at the kitchen counter, her hand resting gently on the edge as she flicked through the pages of the home's updated historical listing. It had taken months to get everything in order, the research, the meticulous documentation of the house's past, the architectural drawings she had sketched so many years ago. But now, all of it was finished. The listing was complete, a final acknowledgement of everything she had built, her vision, her hard work. As she read through the description, she paused at the part that mentioned the design and funding of the house. The words were clear, simple, and yet they were everything. She had taken a building that had once been nothing more than an idea in her mind and turned it into something permanent, something that would endure long after she was gone. The listing now bore her name, unmistakable, as permanent as the foundation beneath her feet. She stood still for a moment, letting the weight of it settle around her. This house, her house, was now part of history, not just any history, but hers and Isla's. Everything she had worked for was now documented, preserved, and etched into the very fabric of this place. Veronica moved through each room slowly, taking in every corner, every space. The walls seemed to breathe with her memories, with the laughter, the arguments, the quiet moments she had spent here, the smell of freshly baked bread, the feeling of the sun on her skin through the big front windows, the sound of the garden in bloom. Every detail, from the vaulted ceilings to the polished wood floors, held a piece of her life. It wasn't just a house, it was a reflection of everything she had done, everything she had built from the ground up. She had taken something that was just a frame, just a shell, and turned it into a home. There was no trace of the doubt that had once clouded her, no sense of not belonging. This house belonged to her. It had always been hers. As she walked through the hallway, she glanced into the living room, where the old grand piano sat quietly in the corner. It had been her mother's piano, but she had always been the one to bring it to life. She touched the keys once, letting the soft notes fill the air, the sound resonating through the empty rooms. The music was a reminder, not just of her past, but of how far she had come. She turned to leave, her hand resting briefly on the doorknob, when Isla entered. Her footsteps were light, but there was a sense of quiet strength in her presence, in the way she moved through the space. She had grown up here, too, but now she was part of the future Veronica had fought to give her. Isla stopped in the doorway, her eyes scanning the room, taking in the space with the quiet understanding that had become her own. She had never needed words to know what this place meant, what it had cost her mother. Veronica smiled and motioned to the porch. "Let's sit," she said, her voice soft, as if inviting Isla into the space where everything had begun. They moved outside together, their feet falling into a natural rhythm as they made their way to the magnolia tree. It stood in the yard, its roots deep in the soil, just like the house itself. The tree had been planted the year Isla was born, a symbol of new life, new beginnings. And now it was a reminder of all that had been nurtured and grown here. They sat beneath the tree, the evening light casting long shadows over the yard. The air was still, save for the soft rustle of leaves, and for a moment they just sat in silence, watching the world go by. Veronica's hand rested in her lap, her fingers lightly tracing the edges of the notebook she'd kept for years. "No one takes from you what you built for yourself," she said, her voice low but firm. The words weren't just for Isla, they were for herself too, for everything she had worked for everything she had sacrificed. This house, this life, it had always been hers, and now Isla would carry it forward. Isla nodded slowly, the weight of her mother's words settling over her. She understood, she always had. This wasn't just about the house, it was about resilience, about the strength to create something from nothing and make it last. It was about the future, about carrying that torch. They sat there for a long while, the silence comfortable now, as the sun sank lower, casting the world in shades of gold. The moment felt timeless. The house stood behind them, its windows catching the last of the light, its presence strong and steady. It wasn't just a place, it was a legacy, a living, breathing testament to all that had been fought for. When they returned to the house, Veronica moved to the front door, her hand resting gently on the brass plaque that had been installed earlier in the week. It read, "Hale House, designed, funded, and protected by Veronica Hale." It was simple, understated, but it was perfect. Brielle and Evan never returned to the house. Veronica hadn't expected them to. There was nothing left for them here. They had never truly understood what this place meant. Theirs had always been an inheritance of entitlement, while Veronica's had been built from the ground up, brick by brick, with blood, sweat, and vision. And Isla? Isla would carry this place, this legacy, forward. The final line echoed in Veronica's mind, the words she had kept close for so long, but had never spoken aloud. "At my son's engagement party," his fiancée's mother said, "she looks like she doesn't belong here." And my son laughed with her. He wasn't laughing when he learned the party and the house they stood in were both mine. The house and everything it represented had always been hers. Now it was Isla's, and together they would continue what had been started, long ago, under the shade of that magnolia tree.